Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What can institutions of higher learning do to help combat climate change, poverty, and illiteracy? How can business and management schools team up with the UN Global Compact and other groups to help achieve these goals? My guest today is going to bring us up to date on a very interesting program. My guest today is Mr. Jonas Haertle. Mr. Jonas Haertle is the head of the Principles for Responsible Management Education called PRIME, which is an initiative of the UN Global Compact. Prior to joining the United Nations, Mr. Haertle worked as a research analyst at NDR in Germany. Mr. Jonas Haertle, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you very much, Bill, for having me here.
I appreciate you being with me. We're going to get into your very interesting program of PRIME in just a moment. Let's talk, kind of tie that into the UN Global Compact. That's really the overarching entity within which you operate your program. Briefly, what is the UN Global Compact, and then we'll talk about PRIME.
Of course. So the UN Global Compact started in 2000. It was the brainchild of Kofi Annan, the then Secretary General, and a few others here in the Secretary General's office of the UN. The basic idea was, how can the UN encourage the business sector, the private sector, to take more responsibility? So the UN set up the UN Global Compact now 17 years back to engage companies, multinationals, as much as small and medium-sized enterprises all around the world, around 10 principles, and that program is now 9,000 companies strong. However, there were always other stakeholders, academic institutions, NGOs, and that's also the reason why we created other initiatives similar to Global Compact to engage, in this case, PRIME higher education institutions.
And of course, our viewers, if they'd like more information on Global Compact, they can go to www.unglobalcompact.org. And if they want more information on your program, they can go to unprme.org and get much more information about what we're going to talk about today. Well, let's go right into PRIME. What is the Principles for Responsible Management Education?
It's a UN-supported initiative to engage business and management schools. So similar to the UN Global Compact, the idea is to offer a principle-based platform for business and management schools to engage on. And the key ask is that business schools should focus in their teaching, but also in research, on how can business become a force for good. And what do we mean by that? In these days where the UN is advocating a lot around the Sustainable Development Goals, how can business education, how can management education focus on helping to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals?
Now, when I think of businesses, a lot of terms come to mind, but one is corporate social responsibility. That's a term we've been hearing about for years and years. That is what we're talking about, basically, is it not how businesses can be better corporate citizens, how they can work towards some of these common problems that we have, such as climate change, poverty, illiteracy, and try to really help overcome these problems.
Definitely. That's definitely the starting point. What is corporate social responsibility? That's at the heart of the issue. There has been a lot of research actually coming out of the business schools we work with, and that's certainly at the heart of it. So what is the responsibility of companies in this global age, where many of the challenges can't just be tackled by governments or other entities, but business has to play a role? So that's where corporate social responsibility, corporate responsibility, and corporate sustainability as concepts have come from.
You mentioned a minute ago business and management schools. Years ago, maybe I'm the only one who did it, lumped them together, business management schools. But today, is there a distinction between a business school and a management school? They're two similar yet perhaps overlapping but different disciplines?
Definitely. I've come to learn that as well.
In my time now, I'm glad I'm not the only one.
There is a distinction. So when we started, we reached out to business schools, but we very much liked that many business schools began to call themselves management schools, because the basic concept of management can be applied obviously to business, but also to other organizations. And nowadays, management schools train future leaders that go into business, they go into public entities, governments, or they go into NGOs. All of them are in need of good management skills. And if you connect that with responsibility and sustainability topics, you really have a forceful group of people coming out of these management schools. So there is the distinction between business and management insofar that management is a little bit wider in terms of the organizations graduates of management schools work for.
Now you're commemorating your 10th anniversary, I believe, of the PRIME program. I believe that's correct. And how many schools do you have in different areas of the world? We can't go through all of them, obviously, but how many schools roughly do you have participating in this program?
So we started in 2007 with the first intake of 100 schools. The basic idea is a school's dean or president signs up the school to the platform, to the PRIME principles. Now we have over 650 business and management schools in approximately 85 countries. We are global, so these schools are literally everywhere in these 84 countries, so around the globe in all 5 continents. And so we are currently, while we are seeing, a high percentage in Western Europe, Northern America, it is also a growing trend that we see schools specifically from China and India now come on board more strongly.
Really, very interesting. How do you advertise this? Obviously, I guess folks could go, the dean of a business school or a management school could go to unprme.org and see more about it and maybe even sign up online. But how do you get the word out to help advertise the program and talk about the advantages of participating in it?
Nowadays, many schools which are part of the program will invite peers. That's one big draw for schools to know about PRIME. But we've started early on to work with business school, management school associations, those who accredit business schools worldwide, and we partnered with them early on in 2007. So much of the advertisement around PRIME comes through these associations. They are founding members of PRIME together with the United Nations and the UN Global Compact. So that's the second reason. And then we have regional events and global events to which we invite many stakeholders, including those who haven't heard about PRIME. And these regional events are now taking place in many regions around the world. Actually, we have this year over 14 regional meetings. So that's a third driver for outreach to new business schools.
What types of lessons have been learned and what types of transformations have taken place over the last 10 years? You started out, I guess, with a handful of schools, or maybe 0, I'm not sure, and today you have a much larger number than that. Have there been lessons learned from dealing with these business and management schools, and how have you seen they've evolved as far as focusing on these very important principles that you're talking about?
Certainly, we have witnessed impact and changes. I think the best way to describe it is to say we started in 2007, so that was really literally a year before the global financial crisis occurred. And so a year after we had started, there was a lot of soul searching among many institutions, but of course also business education institutions. So back then, the trend was to include an ethics class, an ethics course in any degree. Nowadays, 10 years later, we see that while it is not yet cross-cutting the notion of responsibility and sustainability, we've seen a much higher number of courses being offered in that space. And I think on another level, we can see that business school accreditation organizations have taken up a stronger role and a stronger view on ethics, responsibility, and sustainability issues. And they have mandated for the last years all the schools that they accredit to actually feature these courses in the regular curriculum of business degrees. So that's a trend, and we have seen that evolving over the years. And we are definitely seeing impact and also changes. There are still challenges, and I think the basic paradigm of business and management education is still too short-term oriented. So there is need still to make more in terms of transformation, but we are seeing progress over the last 10 years.
Have you had a chance, and maybe this is too complicated, I hope I'm not doing that, but have you had a chance to do kind of a longitudinal study with some of the people who have come through the programs as to what they're doing today, maybe 10 years later or 5 years later, as they move out into the business world or they become managers and are involved in hopefully implementing the principles and this corporate social responsibility, the ethical values that you've been talking about?
It's a good question. We didn't do such a study yet, but it's a good
There's plenty of time.
Yeah.
There's plenty of time.
We should maybe consider that. We definitely have anecdotal evidence of students of management schools that are part of the PRIME program that have entered the workplace and have made differences. But I think the biggest trends is to be seen with the incoming group of students. Currently still, many of them are from the millennial generation. And when you look at studies there, what is remarkable is that many of those individuals will state that whatever work or whatever dedication they will do after they graduate, they want to see purpose in what they do. So purpose means nothing else than if they work for a company, they want to see more than shareholder value being increased. They want to see that the company or the organization they work for helps to solve real world issues. And that's what is encouraging to see in studies among these millennials. And we have some studies done that business school students particularly seem to increasingly demand that also in their education.
Now you mentioned, you alluded earlier to the Sustainable Development Goals, and these are 17 logical, practical, achievable goals, measurable goals too, that were adopted in 2015. They'll run to 2030. And they range from, so I mentioned 17, they range from eliminating poverty to eliminating hunger to promoting quality education for all to combating climate change, promoting sustainable development, and some others we won't get into probably. Excuse me, but how important are those goals, and how do you factor them into the curriculum and into this whole discussion on what we've been talking about?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Bill. I mean, as many of your viewers will know, the UN launched the Sustainable Development Goals just 2 years back. The so-called Agenda 2030 is really the overarching umbrella for many UN initiatives. So we with PRIME started 2 years back to think, how can these Sustainable Development Goals become really the North Star for our initiative? And I'm very happy to see that many business schools have begun to look specifically at the Sustainable Development Goals. So we've seen first really great efforts. I mean, schools have put new courses into the curricula focusing on the Sustainable Development Goals and giving students a way to distinguish themselves. For example, they get a certificate at the end of their studies if they focus on the SDGs. So we want to foster that type of change, and we are committed in the future, until Agenda 2030 is to be achieved at the year 2030, to continue focusing on that and putting an emphasis on this for business schools, management schools that we work with.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with any type of media outlet, be it a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps it's a university or that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you just have a website and you'd like to share our programs, please feel free to do so. You're invited to upload the programs because Global Connections Television is provided as a public service, free of charge, at no cost, to help people better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today we're talking with an expert who's working with management and business schools to help incorporate a variety of ethical values and to focus on how institutions of higher education can combat poverty, climate change, and illiteracy. My guest today is Mr. Jonas Haertle. Jonas Haertle is the head of the PRIME, the Principles for Responsible Management Education program within the United Nations Global Compact. We're talking about the Sustainable Development Goals and how important they are. And you mentioned that a large number of viewers are already aware of them, but there's so many institutions that are out there that are working towards achieving some of these goals. You can look at the service clubs like Rotary International, Kiwanis, Lions, different ones like that, faith-based groups. Almost all the faith-based groups are involved in some way, shape, or form. But so often the word doesn't get down to the individual members of a group that these are important goals and we need to work on achieving them. Do you bring that, do you factor that in when you're trying to get your message out to help that message get not only into the business schools, but also to to people who would have an interest in this area who might be with other organizations?
Definitely. I mean, I think the Sustainable Development Goals are not meant as a UN initiative only.
Exactly, right.
They're meant really as a global agenda, to leave nobody behind. That's what the slogan is. And when I talk to many business school students, they ask me similar questions, and I can only tell you, I was present at the time when governments and other stakeholders in 2012 at the Rio Earth Summit began to create at least the idea around the Sustainable Development Goals. And that's a good story, because there were literally thousands of people together with governments in Rio at that time in Brazil to think about what should sustainable development be and what are the main challenges to focus on. And that's also the process that the UN took to create the Sustainable Development Goals. Many, many individuals, apart from governments, helped to contribute to them. So the Agenda 2030 is meant to be implemented through governments and with the help of many stakeholders, not least business, and of course also many of the educational institutions. That's an agenda for everybody to get involved in, and nobody should wait for somebody to tell them, wait until somebody else tells you what to do around these Sustainable Development Goals. You can get engaged.
Mm-hmm. Do you find there's more interest amongst the various schools? Do you see that more and more people are going to your website, calling you, looking at opportunities to get involved in talking about Prime?
We definitely see an uptake. We see, numbers coming in. We grow by 10% every year, so we do have a growth, and we have more interest. We have a growth target of reaching 1,000 business schools in 2020. Mm-hmm. By one count, there are about 16,000 business and management schools worldwide, many of them in China and India alone. So we still have a way to reach, but we have given ourselves the goal, first of all, to reach 1,000 schools, and we are on the way to get there.
And I think you'll make it. I'm sure you will. Now, you had you were talking about conferences, and you had in July of this year a 2017 Prime Global Forum. What exactly was that? What was the goal, and what came out of it as far as suggestions or recommendations or procedures to follow?
Right. So this was our 10th anniversary event on the global level. So we brought together about 300 stakeholders from our business and management schools, deans, rectors, faculty members, students, business representatives, with three purposes. We wanted to take stock of where do we stand 10 years after creating Prime. So we heard a lot of examples from individual schools, networks that we helped to create, for example, Prime chapters, our working groups, on what they had achieved, what the impact was that they had done over the last 10 years. Secondly, we wanted to learn from each other, and so there was a lot of interactive program. We had roundtable discussions, we had focus sessions, and we interacted also with governments that came for the high-level political forum that took place during the Prime Global Forum. And thirdly, we looked into the next decade and gave ourselves a roadmap. And the roadmap is clearly focused on the Sustainable Development Goals. So our path over the next 10 years for Prime is pretty clearly cut out. We want to engage more business schools, and those that we engage, we want to engage around the Sustainable Development Goals.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals. All 17 are very important. Do you have 3 or 4 that you focus on in particular, such as quality education or eradicating poverty or promoting or combating climate change? Do you have 3 or 4 that you're focusing on and then bringing the others in as you go along?
Definitely SDG 4 on quality education is the basis also for Prime. But there are any of the SDGs could be relevant. But we have seen a strong interest in the climate action SDG, and for example, SDG number 1 on eliminating poverty. And let me just give you maybe an example. Not too recently, I've been in Peru, where I met with a business school student who had done a consultancy project as part of his coursework. And I was amazed by the fact that as part of his assignment, he was assigned to work with a local business to helping them to develop a business plan to increase their revenues. But at the same time, he told me that this was a business in the informal sector in Peru. And so through the consultancy with a group of students, they actually help to legalize this business and help to give the people working there a more steady income. Throughout, when I talked to him, he never mentioned the fact that this was meant to do something along the lines of poverty reduction or elimination. But I told him this is exactly the type of example we would like to see according to SDG number 1. And when I told him that, it was really interesting to see his reaction, that he never thought about it as contributing to SDG number 1, but more from a business side. And I think these are the type of actions we want to encourage in business school students, that they think, how can they make a contribution, not just when they're studying, of course, but also when they go out into the market through their business action to help focus on any or a combination of the Sustainable Development Goals.
And you mentioned the informal sector, the informal economy, and apparently the informal economy is huge in the developing countries and even developed countries to a large degree, as far as businesses that are off the grid, businesses that nobody even knows about. They're providing services. It may be somebody's working as a maid or something like that, or doing some type of providing other services, handyman service or whatever it may be. But do you find that has been the case, that this is, the informal economy is absolutely an untapped market that is huge, that we need to focus on? In certain markets, certainly. I mean, I mentioned Peru as one example, many Latin American countries, but many developing countries around the world would have that issue. And I certainly think that's an area to focus on. We know that many of the graduates from the business schools we work with won't go into that sector, but they can certainly have an influence on that. So social innovation and social enterprises are one means to help get people from the informal into the formal sector. And that's certainly some of the examples we have seen now that come encouraged through the work of business schools and the students and the graduates. Now, you're celebrating your 10th anniversary, and as you look over the horizon, you say that you had a roadmap as to where you'd like to be. What would you like to see 10 years from now, as far as your program, maybe the UN Global Compact as a whole? It seems to be growing, and what would you like to see accomplished between now and then, and who would you like, or how many folks would you like to see involved in your activities? In 10 years, we want to see tipping points in certain markets. And I think, in certain markets we have that potential already now. So for example, in the UK, we have over half of the business schools that are presently in the UK signed up to the PRIME program. So we want to see that in more countries around the world, number one. But for those who are engaged with us, we would like to see a number of changes. And the main change is really that the main paradigm of business should be, in our view, to be a force for good. And again, that comes back to the Sustainable Development Goals. We want to see businesses, of course, make a financial profit, and at the same time focus on eliminating poverty, helping help to address the climate change problem, look at gender equality, and a number of the other issues connected to the Sustainable Development Goals. So if that becomes the main paradigm for business school education in 10 years, that would be a success criteria. Exactly. And in the last 30 seconds we have, what do you see as your biggest challenge as you work towards these very laudable goals? Well, organizing a global movement. How to do that? That continues to be a challenge for us. We are a small office here in the New York UN seat. We have regional chapters. Much of the work is done by volunteers. But how to organize a growing movement, that's our main challenge at the moment. It certainly is, and it sounds as though you're well on track to do that. You're making great inroads in with the business and management schools, and of course these are just tremendously important, as we all know, to get the private sector involved and to get them to where they want to help combat climate change, to overcome poverty and illiteracy. In the last 10 seconds we have, do you feel that they're actually starting to really move quickly into adopting this approach and to really want to get involved? I think it's a slow moving but very direct movement. I think the best examples are the students who we talk to, who are enlightened by this new type of education and who seem to want more of that. Exactly. And many of these students will go into the private sector. They may go work with non-governmental organizations. They may work in governmental institutions, but they will have the basic skills and the ethic. That's the important thing, to have that internal ethic to want to achieve, to be corporate, socially responsible entities no matter where they are. But Jonas Haertle, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.